the Mandela rules that were passed in 2015. They make some references to the environmental conditions of detention. They make no references at all to the sound environment, nothing on the acoustics of the environment, very little on light, very little on things like air and temperature, and absolutely nothing on sound at all. And to me, that seemed really shocking because this came after a period in which there was so much media attention on the subject of how music and sound had been used in torture, and it seemed a little bit strange to have no reflection at all of that.
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with your host, writer and scholar of genocide studies, Sabah Karim. I am your co-host, Luis Gonzalez Aponte.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Morag Grant is a musicologist whose work explores the intersections of music, society, and human rights. Morag has conducted pioneering research on the use of music in collective violence, including its role in torture and military contexts. Currently, she is leading a project with her colleague, Casey McCall-Smith, on the environmental conditions of detention and their implications for human rights. Join us as we delve into her insights on music's complex role in human, social, and political life. Your research on music and violence crosses multiple disciplines, including sociology, anthropology, and musicology. What initially motivated you to explore the intersection of music, violence, and social issues?
I think it basically came from the fact that I was already interested in issues to do with human rights violations, to do with war and conflict. That's a long-standing interest that I've had even since before I began to study musicology. And also around about the time that I started to move into this field, I was also involved in quite a lot of human rights activism. So I was doing campaigning work against torture, against other human rights abuses. And I think basically through that, I could see on the one hand, I kept noticing within the terms of the human rights campaigning work that I was involved in, maybe references to music. If I was reading reports, I would maybe be coming across things that were mentioned often just in passing, but that jumped out to me as a musicologist, as references to music always do. I was also involved in a project in which I was looking specifically at song studies around about that time, and there was a lot of research that came out in that field in Germany, where I was living at that point, specifically looking at the ways that music generally, but also song in particular, had been used during the Nazi regime in the 1930s and 1940s. And so all of those things kind of started to come together for me. I started to kind of look into that, draw on it for my teaching, and the more and more that I looked at it, I could see that there were a lot of issues still to be addressed in that. And in particular, what I found that was at that point, more or less with the exception of the work that was being done on the uses of music by the Nazis directly, there was a tendency when talking about music and war and the music and human rights to always focus on the positive uses of music and to automatically assume that music was something that promotes freedom and promotes peace and conflict resolution and those kind of things. But there wasn't nearly enough work done or anything on the opposite side of the equation, and particularly not when we move closer to actual violent acts that would explain what you discover very quickly when you look into the topic, which is that music is very, very often used, well, not very, very often used, but much more often than you would think it is used in those contexts. It seems to play a significant role in facilitating these violent acts to happen. So that was kind of the multiple roads that led me into this topic originally.
I definitely see that, especially with regard to music as communication, that you've discussed before, and that it is not inherently bad or good. The tool is used in that behavior or in the means of communication for it to be bad, pro-social, anti-social, however you want to characterize it. Right. In your research, you discuss how music can be used to promote and facilitate and accompany acts of collective violence. especially in contexts like Nazi Germany that you just mentioned. Could you explain the mechanisms through which music becomes a tool for normalizing violence or a tool in that communication and reinforcing ideologies in such genocidal regimes?
I think the first key to that is what you said there was, music in the context of collective violence. And the word collective, I think, is the one that's really crucial here. Because whether or not it's in, the context of propaganda, or if it's in the context of different rituals that we find to enable acts of great violence to occur, or even to train people to come together and be able to inflict that violence, we find music being used there because it is such a powerful tool in terms of consolidating, forming, and underlining processes of group formation, processes of identity formation, and those kind of things. And I think that is really, really crucial. You can see this very much, for example, there are more formalised ways in which this happens in terms of martial organisations, military organisations. You will often find music being used in recruitment campaigns. For example, there's a very long history of that. Music also being used in the context of training, in drill, partly to help coordinate movements when learning how to manage weapons, for example, but also to consolidate this feeling of group identity within the fighting unit itself. And also then any number of rituals that are used at every stage really of military life to provide a kind of a framework within which that violence is then found. Even if you move out of those more formalised systems, I think that the formalised systems are interesting because it demonstrates that it is important enough that it becomes an essential part of military life and warrior cultures in most societies. When we move beyond that, again, it has to do with the ways that music can be used for identity formation and therefore for the feeling of collective identity, which again and again has been demonstrated to be really, really important in enabling these acts of violence. They are ones that are carried out on behalf of a particular collective identity and by a group that understands itself as sharing that collective identity. And music is important in many ways. Music is important because it is a really useful way of coordinating activities and attention in time. And that has been shown to be something that, again, tends to bring people together in a group formation. And we also know, I think all of us know, just from thinking about the role of music in our day-to-day lives, it is very closely linked to our emotional lives, to our emotional memories as well. We tend to be very, very attached to music that has played some kind of a key role in terms of our life stories and the identities that go with that. These are things that are very elicit very strong reactions from people as well. And for that reason as well, music can be really, really useful precisely in, I would say, not even so much the formation of ideas of outgroups, although that comes with it as well. But I think particularly it is really important in the formation of in groups, whether or not they be positive in groups or in groups that ultimately are going to be then utilised to inflict great acts of violence. I think that's something that is, if you then jump on to think about how music is approached in human rights discourses around things like freedom of speech or freedom of expression, that tends to become quite complex because within those contexts, we're always looking for the very straightforward idea of hate speech as something that very clearly is an incitement to violence, is a way of framing the outgroup as such. And there's not enough understanding, I think, of the other aspect to that, which is at least as important, which is how the in-group itself is formed and consolidated and made to hold together as a group. And that is something where I think music can be really, really important.
You touched on several different topics that you had prior mentioned in your 2015 work, Music, the Third Reich, and the 8 stages of genocide, which is quite comprehensive and talks about music in each of these stages of genocide proposed by Gregory Stanton, of which I was most surprised of how present it is in each of them, especially in denial in the last stage, as well as in the stages like preparation. And certain things come into my mind, such as music policies and organizations that were formed. I think it was the Musikkammer, the music cultural chamber under the Nazi regime. But I do want to dive into the actual presence of music in acts of violence, where in your work you focus on musical activities in concentration camps, such as in Majdanek and Sachsenhausen. You described how music was weaponized. Could you expand on the psychological, emotional, or let's say myriad of uses of music by the perpetrators, its effects on the perpetrators, and its appropriate effects on their victims?
Let's start with the perpetrators, I think, as well. And I should say, so the article that you mentioned, that was one that I co-wrote with the members of my former research group. And we had actually started to look specifically at the work that had been done on music under Nazism, precisely because there was such a wide body of research available there, and it seemed to us the best place to kind of start to draw these different individual and very detailed case studies together and to see what you could develop theoretically from that. And the Gregory Stanton model then, as it was in the 8 stages when we were starting work on this, provided a good frame to kind of test these things out. And we were also so surprised to find that you could actually map things on not one-to-one, but there were definite ways in which you could see music being used really at every stage in the preparation and also in the carrying out of the genocide. In terms of when you move into that last but one stage, the stage before denial, as in so many systems, not just in Stanton's, I think that music is something that I already mentioned that rituals are very important in martial organizations, military organizations, and there are a number of reasons for that. And one of the reasons is that violence is normally not something that it is easy for human beings to carry out on one another. There are certain exceptions to that, but generally speaking, it is something that we would shy away from. We might threaten violence, but actually carrying through to physical violence is a little bit more difficult. And it is also something, especially when you go into that context of being then directly confronted with a violent act, it has impacts on you mentally, psychologically as well. Military organisations have always known this. They've always known that you need to be able to somehow, on the one hand, enable that violence, enable people to overcome the inbuilt barriers that they have, or the cultural barriers that have been created, the social barriers that normally prevent us from inflicting violence. But also we need to be able to contain that violence as well, contain it both within making sure that the limits remain within which violence is carried out, but also limit it in terms of the psychological impacts on those who perpetrate it as well. And these are the reasons why we have the rituals developing, because rituals are ways in which we manage very, very difficult situations. We manage transitions into those situations and back out of them, and we give them certain forms of meaning. And again, the more that you look at music in these terms, you will find music being used not just in the context of very conscious rituals of transition into violence out again, but as ways of indicating certain frames of reference within which that violence is actually being carried out. And I think that is something that is very, very important. There are a lot of incidences in the context of genocide as well that could be understood in that connection as well. That's then the one aspect. Another aspect of it as well, and it's very, very closely linked to that, if you think about rituals as being a form of performance, so Victor Turner has famously talked about the transition from ritual to theatre, where theatre is a kind of a secularized form of rituals. And we know as well, if scholars of violence are quite used to thinking about violence as being a form of communication and itself a performative act because it's also a form of communication. And I think that in that context as well, if you start to understand, look at these acts in terms of a performance, as horrible as that seems, but in terms of personas that people adopt in that context, of roles that they feel as if they are carrying out, of ways that they want that violence to be understood by others. Again, this is somewhere that music then starts to play a role. It can play a role in the ways that people will kind of psych themselves up for that. It will play a role in the way that they then, as it were, transition into these personas, the personas of the killer, the perpetrator, and also come back out again. There's been a lot of work that's been done as well in terms of, again, the Nazi concentration camps, that has looked at what seems to be this, for many people, this cognitive disconnect between the horrific acts of genocide that were being carried out and the officers, the commanders of the camps, then being reported to in the evening sit down and listen to Beethoven, to Schubert, whatever. But again, from another perspective, you can see that as a way in which those acts are relativized by, as Juliana Brauer has talked about, kind of shoring up the sense of self by retreating to these markers of civilized personality and of civilization as a way of kind of internally, mentally justifying what has happened within that particular frame. And I think that in terms of the perpetrators being offered those existing frameworks within which to carry out these actions, it is a way as well where people can adopt the personas, they can adopt the roles, but they also, to some extent, can kind of maybe think less about what it is that they're actually doing, because what they're actually doing is just carrying out this role or going through the motions of this activity within this framework that has already been set up for them. They just have to kind of carry on and not really think too much about what it is that they're doing. So I think in terms of the perpetrators, that is something that's very important and is not that really hasn't been adequately explored and I think addressed, because we do obviously have an inbuilt tendency, I think, to want to distance ourselves very much from the perpetrators of these acts, to think that there is something mentally different with these people that are able to do these things. And we want to distance them from all of the things that we think, again, are markers of civilization and markers of freedom and justice and these kinds of things as well. So it's a very, very complex question, but one that I think does need to be explored in more detail.
To that point that you were mentioning about ritualizing and the role of music as ritual to perpetrators, I think we had a prior guest on the podcast, Edward Westerman, who in his book Drunk on Genocide, he mentioned something to the same effect of music being used in this way, but in tandem with alcohol consumption by the Nazis in the Near East. What I want to ask if you could speak further about, because you mentioned very briefly there that these perpetrators would be listening to certain kinds of music. They'd be listening to whether it's Strauss or whether it's Wagner or whether it's even more Coco, let's say, era music. That also serves to other their victims, but also give them the sense that their culture is in some superior way to the others. However, this is a very interesting situation, I find, as a musician, because in these cases, especially within the Holocaust, everybody associated in this context is coming from that same culture. they would have heard and they would have all known the leads of Schubert and Schumann. I'm wondering if you can speak more to the point of how the Nazi perpetrators differentiated and marginalized Jewish composers and music in that time.
They did their best to do it with great difficulty, it has to be said, particularly when they were dealing with composers that were very integral to the German tradition. So people like Mendelssohn, who were also very, very popular composers as well. And what you see in terms of the official Nazi policy is a starting point where they're full of great ideals of how they're going to cleanse German music of these foreign influences, and particularly these Jewish influences, and then also American influences and the influences of African American music and these kind of things. But as things progress, and particularly once you actually come into the time of the war itself, you then find a lot of exceptions being made to those general rules, because it was understood that the most important thing was to keep your own population on board, to keep them happy and distracted. And if they wanted, to listen to swing music, then that would have to be provided for them, albeit by German swing bands that you decided to invent for that very purpose. I think it is. It's quite complex, but it's obviously the same way as with everybody, with every other aspect of life in Germany from the time that the Nazis took over in the early 1930s. You found Jewish cultural organisations being set up within which context Jewish musicians, for example, could perform. That was the only context in which they could perform. And what is interesting is that these kinds of initiatives, and again we see this later on in some of the early years of the camps, a similar strategy being adopted of consciously creating these cultural institutions constantly, also for example forming the camp orchestras as well, or allowing certain musical activities, theatrical activities to take place in the ghettos, as a way of deflecting from actually what was going on there, but by basically saying, but we're allowing Jewish musicians to carry on performing, but we are saying that they have to do this within their own cultural milieu. And similarly, in the context of the camps, we are obviously promoting cultural life, because these camps are, sticking whatever justification we always have for putting civilians in camps in terms of wartime. That this is what these camps are about, and you're deflecting the attention away and making it seem as if there is something more positive going on with life here. So I think it's an interesting case as well, because there were again the attempts to erase Jewish music from German life. That was relatively easy in the case of a composer like Arnold Schoenberg, because very few people liked his music anyway. It was much more difficult in the case of Mendelssohn, because his music was simply so popular. Even though there were official bans, you will actually find, and a lot of researchers that have looked in detail at the archival material, have basically found that they talked a good talk, but in actual practice, it wasn't nearly as simple to eradicate Jewish composers and Jewish musicians from German life.
Thank you. I have a question about music and torture specifically. I think in your research, including the discussion of Nazi concentration camps and your work on contemporary detention settings, you have drawn parallels between historical and modern uses of music and torture. What are some of the key similarities and differences you've identified between the use of music in these settings?
I think one of the basic similarity is that music has very often been used in these contexts, and that was something that was and is very important to emphasize, because we tend generally to think about the use of music and torture as having occurred in a very small set of circumstances. Most people associate it with what happened in the US War on Terror. Some people might also know a few more examples, such as, again, what happened in the context of the concentration and the extermination camps in Nazi Germany. But to actually point out it is still a problem, since allegedly the torture practices were shut down in the War on Terror. It's also something that has a much longer history stretching back. It's very, very important to understand that in order to understand also what the scale of the problem is, and also because it gives us a different way into thinking about what some of the roots of these different traditions are and why they are used, and get beyond some of the slightly simplistic ideas that you often find about why music is used and what kinds of music are used, for example. So if you look at the Nazi concentration camps, and there are also some similarities as well to what happened in the Stalinist gulags as well. What is interesting there, not just in terms of what happened with music, is that there are certain similarities to the way that the camps are organised, to the way that military camps and barracks would have been organised as well. So similar to the way that the military organisations would have had their own bands and their own musicians that would play on certain occasions, similar to the fact that you had a parade ground, which was used for roll call, and music had a role to play there. Music had a role to play. Musicians had a role to play during punishment and that kind of thing. These are all things that you find again being used, for example, in the context of the concentration camps, and sometimes with very similar terminology being used to describe what is actually happening. So you see, from that perspective, you can see this line carrying through, or the way that the music has been used in the military, which has certainly in European modernity always been very closely associated with ideas of discipline and order, and obviously then following on from that with ideas about punishment and justice within the context of the military. So you do see again those kind of frameworks that are following through, and that might explain some of the ways that music is used within these contexts, albeit ultimately in some very, very different ways in these later contexts where specifically music is being used as a form of torture. But you also find as well, if you look back through history, the connections between different processes of shaming people, humiliating people, degrading people, that used to also be a very central part of punishment practices in the era when these were things that were carried out very, very much in the public eye. And again, you will see again and again music being used in those contexts, and in sometimes quite different ways depending on the context. But the whole way through, you do have this connection of music being used in some situations to draw attention to what's happening, to draw attention to this person who is being, pilloried and shamed in this context, and also in some cases to directly humiliate that person as well. So there are little aspects of this that you do find carrying on the whole way through, even the longer scope of history, if you go right back to the Middle Ages, and possibly even to further back as well. If we move into the more recent past as well, we know that, for example, the ways that music was used in torture in the case of the US War on Terror, these were by no means a new invention. In fact, the US Department of State itself had a few years previously called these a method of torture when talking about other countries that had carried out these methods. And these methods go back at least to the aftermath of the Second World War, into the period of the early Cold War. They're linked to different experiments that were being carried out at that point with methods of sensory deprivation, different methods of psychological torture. And we find similar methods cropping up in a number of places around the world, not least where American and British forces had then been involved in training and supporting certain regimes. We find similar practices being used again and again, even before they then become really famous in the context, as I said, of the War on Terror. So there again, there is a longer historical line here, which unfortunately also doesn't stop with the US War on Terror. It is still carrying on today, which is something that we managed to establish in the work that my former research group did, that, for example, in certain prison camps in the Russian Federation, for example, particularly in cases of solitary confinement, exposure to loud music is still used, and other forms of forced music making. So forcing people to sing, forcing people to march to music, those kind of things are still very, very prevalent right up to the present day.
To that point of music being used and involved in torture, considering the role of music in various forms of torture and violence within this regard, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that the United Nations put out a press release only, I think, 2 months ago in August, saying that there's plenty of testimonies that this is currently happening in conflict zones currently. What are some of the steps that are being taken to ensure accountability and prevention in the future? Because certain names to mind come like the Bikindi trial, with regard to some of the music that was put out on the RTLM radio during the Rwandan genocide, where this music was inciting violence, or at least was seen as inciting violence. The Clinton administration, I think you noted that the Clinton administration had means to block or jam these radio signals, but didn't, however, go ahead and do so in Burundi. And the ethics of that are still, in question. So as a general question with regard to music in mass violence, what accountability measures have been taken in the past, and what may be taken if we were to see it around the world now?
Yeah, not enough, I think, is a straight answer to that question. Again, I think there are two different aspects to that question. I think the question of the role of music in incitement and in the promotion of violence, and how it's actually used in the context of torture. Those are different things, and they have to be obviously approached differently in terms of accountability, or in prevention as well, in terms of human rights laws and human rights standards. The context, I think, with freedom of expression and freedom of speech and the limits of that right, I've already indicated, I think, are particularly complex when it comes to music, because it is not the case that we can always point to a very clear lyrical reference or a very clear, use of imagery along with music, or something that would be prescribed in any national setting, for example. And that obviously is different depending whereabouts we are in the world. Even though we know that, for example, in the context of extreme white supremacist music, white power music, there are very, very well established networks of this music, and that movement very much understands how important music is, in terms, again, of not so much getting the message across to new potential members, although that as well, particularly when younger people and children are being targeted, but more as a way to emotionally charge the existing in-group, and to make them, to consolidate that group and make them more likely to then carry out acts of direct or indirect violence. And I think that is something that is very difficult for us to talk about, particularly in the West, because we find it really difficult to think of there being any necessary limits to freedom of expression. We think that allowing complete freedom of expression is going to be what is going to stop all of the evil in the world. And unfortunately, it doesn't quite work like that. And so that is a very, very complex issue. And I think it's that has to be addressed very much in the context of looking at how we can do this tightrope walk effectively of being able to protect freedom of expression, but also to be able to protect and promote the right to life, the right to freedom from discrimination, all of these other human rights, because obviously we can't see them individually, they have to interconnect. Potentially looking at this through the lens of musical practice and through cultural practice generally is a way to start those conversations and to start moving away from this, the idea of a very, to be a need for a very clear causal statement of intent or incitement in those contexts. In the context of how music is used in torture, I think basically awareness raising is the most important aspect of this, because that is what we come up against time and again and time and again. Even amongst human rights advocates, and I say, this is somebody who has reached out to human rights activists and organisations a number of times, sometimes with a lot of success and sometimes with no success at all. I think that unless people have either themselves had direct contact with survivors of this kind of torture, or who have otherwise been very, very closely involved with, for example, survivor testimony, I think without that being there, people don't understand how important this is. They do tend to see it as being slightly more trivial than other aspects of torture, even though survivors themselves very often have come out and in some cases said this is the worst thing that they experienced in this context. And even though we know, and the UN Committee Against Human Rights, has said as much, that particularly in particular contexts, some of these acts do count as violations against the prohibition of torture. So I think it's all about awareness raising. It's also about raising general awareness of the sounding environment, the sonic environment, and how important that is for health and well-being. Because particularly when you're looking at a context of prevention, you are wanting to prevent any possibility that harm can be done intentionally, but also unintentionally as well. This is why I've recently launched a new project on the environmental conditions of detention together with Dr. Casey McCall-Smith, who's my colleague in the law school here at the University of Edinburgh. And that is a project that's specifically geared towards drawing attention to the physical environment of detention and all the things that go towards making up that environment, be it the air that we breathe, the light that we have to see or not, the sound as well, all of these aspects, temperature as well, which is very, very important, obviously, for well-being, and is essential for life to have the temperature regulated. Basically to draw attention to these things amongst prison monitors, including in cases where they're not necessarily looking at cases of torture as such, but also other cases that might amount to being forms of cruel and degrading treatment or punishment, or just generally, not acceptable standards. One of the reasons why we also started up that project is because even in the guidelines that we have for minimum standards in prisons, so the latest UN set of standard minimum rules, known as the Mandela Rules, that were passed in 2015, they make some references to the environmental conditions of detention. They make no references at all to the sound environment, nothing on sonic conditions, nothing on the acoustics of the environment, very little on light, very little on things like air and temperature, and absolutely nothing on sound at all. And to me, that seemed really shocking, because this came after a period in which there was so much media attention on the subject of how music and sound had been used in torture, and it seemed a little bit strange to have no reflection at all of that in this new document. And so this is where we're now trying to kind of latch on and work with other organisations and other partners to continue raising awareness of this topic, and to make sure that the scholarship that there is now on this topic. There's quite a growing body of research from within academia that has looked at this topic in various different historical contexts. That is then actually that is used to kind of gain awareness, and hopefully longer term we will see some moves towards guidelines, adjustments to existing standards, for example, to ensure that some steps are taken to make it much more difficult for music to be used, or any form of sound to be used in this context at all.
With context of music and incitement for violence, can we see music as its role in preparation, preceding incitement or coming after? Because I think about one of the examples that you gave, which is music fostering national identity, to go ahead and build a sense of, I don't want to say constructive patriotism. It's more so a isolationist patriotism that is going to go ahead and exclude certain groups, and creating distinct outgroups and in-groups. So as a question, does that preparation precede incitement? Is it necessary for incitement? Is it something that is very prevalent?
It's not necessary for incitement, but it's necessary for the incitement to actually work and for people to follow that. I would say very definitely. And as I say, again, you talked about the in-group and the out-group. What's really important here is the establishment of the in-group. And there are numbers of studies that, again, have looked specifically at that, the dynamic of social movements in all contexts, not just in the context of violence, and have pointed again and again to the importance of cultural practices, including music or cultural practices that sound very like they might have a musical component, in terms of the dynamism of these social movements, the idea of coming behind a central message, and in terms of getting that message across as well. Music can be very important. Music is useful not least because it tells us how to receive the information that we're hearing through other channels, or seeing through other channels. Great example of this would be music and film, for example, or television. You can have one in the same set of scenes that we interpret emotionally and in terms of the narrative completely differently, depending what the music is actually telling us to do and telling us to think and telling us to feel as well. So obviously music can be used in that context of preparation as well, in terms of setting the emotional groundwork for how a message then is going to be perceived. Another aspect of this is very important, is that if you are going to proceed to a stage of, for example, incitement, you have to get your audience there in the first place. How do you get your audience there? Well, one of the ways that you do that is through music. This is exactly how the radio station RTLM functioned. In the run to the Rwandan genocide, for example, you created a radio station that was much more modern, much more popular than the state broadcasters at that time, playing a very, very wide range of music. And basically that meant that people would tune into that station. And when they are there, then you can slip in all of these other little nuggets of disinformation as well as you're going. Similar ways to which the white power movement organises as well, through music, through tying people in, again, forming these emotional communities around and through the music, as much as the messages that are then transported within that music or alongside that music. So I think that to some extent, I would say that music is, if anything, potentially more important in those contexts of preparing the groundwork. You find relatively few instances of music that is carrying an explicit message of incitement, for example. That isn't really how music tends to work, and that's why it becomes difficult for people to understand the role it plays. Similarly to what happened again in the Third Reich, you find many more uses of music to create and underline that idea of the Volksgemeinschaft, so the in-group, and relatively few examples of music outside of specific contexts that were deliberately then targeting the outgroup or actually suggesting any acts that had to be perpetrated against them. Some exceptions to that would be, for example, in the context of things like film music, and this is unfortunately not just an issue that you have in the Nazi era, that we will present certain characters along with racialized stereotypes that are communicated through music as well. But other than that, I would say that really where music's impact is the greatest in these contexts is in how it manages to consolidate the in-group, gather them together at all, get the audience together, and then help to package that message in a way that somehow makes it more palatable than it might do in other contexts.
How do you see your work contributing to our broader understanding of these interdisciplinary fields that are associated with music and violence, including anthropology, sociology?
I'm hoping that it is able to help demonstrate just how important cultural practices are in this context. We tend in our societies nowadays to think of music as being not really essential for society. It's a form of leisure, it's a form of entertainment. We've kind of lost that sense of music as being something that is really fundamental to our ideas about ourselves, to the ways that we communicate. That in itself is a dangerous situation if we lose that that focus or that understanding, that awareness ultimately. And I think though that there is very much more a move towards trying to understand violence in this interdisciplinary context, in connection with ideas about ritual and performance and human behaviour more generally. And that is very much where I think that it's essential also to talk about music, because it is such an essential part of human social life. And through looking at music, through looking at that lens, you get a perspective that you don't necessarily get from looking at other forms of communication and interaction.
I think that's what the newer scholars are trying to do in the sense of not restricting our conversation on anything for that matter to just genocide studies, but expanding it, because we're talking about violence, and violence can be analyzed at the macro and micro level as well.
Absolutely. And I think as well, music is interesting there because you can use it to analyse both. I think for me, the most interesting aspects come if you analyse at the micro level as well, of actually how these situational dynamics develop. And that's why I'm particularly interested in understanding why music ends up in those contexts and what it's actually doing in those contexts as well. And I think absolutely that is the way that the discussion has to go into what is actually happening, really happening in these situations, and not what we like to think is maybe going through people's heads at that time, but the actual dynamics that are contributing there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Morag, for your discussion today, and thank you so much for your work.
Yeah, I'm very happy to help.
This was Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with our guest, Morag Grant. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions.